I'm Barry Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barry.
Welcome to Back Barries, a podcast from Guardian Australia. And we'll open with the Iran war. And as ceasefires go, that could be a fizzer. And why should we be surprised when one party to the negotiations, the United States, just days before said to Iran, your whole civilization will die tonight. The second player, Iran, has recently killed tens of thousands of their own people for peacefully protesting in the streets. And the third player, Israel, continues to bomb Lebanon, causing Pakistan, the country trying to broker a peace deal, to accuse Israel of doing that to sabotage the whole process. That's not the stuff, Tony, that builds trust.
No, it's a fake ceasefire, to borrow language from Donald Trump. Part of the problem, I think, is they've all got some leverage. You know, Iran's got huge leverage with the Straits and opening up that or keeping it closed. America has leverage in terms of their weaponry and capacity, and Israel, of course, still has some leverage because they're a key player in the Middle East, and other countries in the Middle East still want to sort of keep Israel as a bulwark against Iran. So they've all got leverage, and they're all going in their different directions, and I can't see how there's going to be any resolution anytime soon.
Yeah, and the number one sticking point, of course, was not the Strait, as it turned out, though that remains an issue, but it was the fact that Israel continued to bomb Lebanon. The United States said, but that was never part of the agreement. They said that Iran thought it was. They accept that Iran thought it was, but it was a misunderstanding. Now, that has to be the starting point, and yet now you have these separate negotiations going on between Israel and Lebanon. It's such a mess.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Israel aren't fair income about any sort of resolution with their actions there, but again, that comes back to the fact they've still got a bit of leverage there over the United States, even though the United States is their great benefactor or patron. In terms of, but other sort of non-negotiables seems to be, you know, the enrichment of uranium for nuclear capacity in Iran, which they seem unwilling to give up. And that is, you know, at the end of the day, that is a big one because no country wants Iran to have that capacity, especially in the Middle East.
And they haven't given it up. And even if this peace deal had or at least the temporary ceasefire had held, nothing changes on that front. And it's worth contemplating before we look at all of the impact on Australia. Just if this ceasefire had held or does hold, how can Donald Trump claim victory as he did? I mean, I accept that you'd almost give in to his kind of childish declarations of victory just so that things can return to normal and just move on. But when you look at what happened, okay, their military, Iran's military has been severely reduced, but no regime change. Probably the most important of all, the people of Iran are no better placed, no closer to freedom. Donald Trump has denigrated, he's isolated so many of his previous allies. And the Strait of Hormuz, now Iran is pretty much in control, and they're getting something like $2 million a ship in tolls. Alan Kohler pointed out on the ABC the other night that could add up to about $50 billion a year. I think that would have got Donald Trump's attention. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, Donald Trump always creates his own reality. So the playbook would be for Trump to say, we won, greatest victory ever. You know, people still talking about, you know, annihilation. His problem on this, though, is that the MAGA base will see the evidence or the proof point that it's not resolved because they'll see it every time they drive past a gasoline place. And at the moment in Ohio, for example, one of those classic flyover states, it's just under 4 litres a gallon, which is, you know, a huge cost, $4 American a gallon. So that is a signpost to his base that it is not resolved. And you know, the one thing that unites the MAGA base is price of gasoline.
And just before we do talk about Anthony Albanese's responses, and in fact world leaders generally, when you get the kind of language that you get out of the White House now, and has any elected leader in a democracy ever said anything quite as unhinged and disturbing as a whole civilization will die tonight? Now, Anthony Albanese said that it's not appropriate. I think it will cause some concern. There are others who think, well, this is just a negotiating tactic. You frighten them. That's usually what Iran would do. That's what some of these terrorist states, they talk like that. But then Anthony Albanese went on to say it's a long step between a tweet and that suggestion, which implies, look, this is just Trump being Trump. And that's just not good enough. This is minimisation. This is minimising the man, minimising what he's saying and his threats of genocide, straight out genocide, no doubt about it. You know, this concept that you judge him not on his words but on his action. Why does he get that entitlement that nobody else gets? You know, Trump once said that if he walked out into Fifth Avenue and shot somebody, he wouldn't lose a vote. And you can understand now why this guy thinks he can get away with anything when so much of how the world leaders responded to that outrageous comment was kind of diplomatic and muted. It didn't seem to have anger or astonishment attached to it.
Yeah, I think the great leverage point that he does have is he's just so unpredictable and unorthodox. And I think from Albanese's point of view, I thought his language is appropriate. It's certainly, I can't recall an Australian Prime Minister ever saying that an American president's language is unacceptable. So I thought it was pretty tough. But you never want to be in a position with Trump where he can just turn around and unilaterally impose more tariffs on Australia, because that's the kind of unhinged thing he would do. And I think Albanese would remember very clearly when he was opposition leader and ScoMo, for reasons that still escape me, sort of demanded that during coronavirus, COVID, that a full investigation of China and full cooperation by China and access to laboratories and so forth was necessary, which, you know, was a complete overreach. And China just responded by swatting him away and imposing tariffs on Australian goods. And it hurt a lot of Australian agriculture and jobs and trade and so forth. And I remember speaking to one of ScoMo's inner sanctum at the time and sort of saying, "This is madness." And he was like, "Oh, no, we're too big. You know, China can't afford, you know, to do anything like that to us." And I was like, "Yes, they can, mate. They're one of the biggest economic powers in the world. They'll just find another buyer." So I can see why Albanese was a bit cautious. But, yeah, coming back to your point before about, you know, Trump's problem about creating his own reality, you know, Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly and all these sort of podcasters who are great supporters of Trump have been absolutely brutal on him. I'm not sure if you've caught up with Tucker Carlson this week, Barry, if
I have
managed to listen to it. But, yeah, he has been savage on Trump, and he's speaking to a lot of the MAGA base. And I think the one thing that Trump does recognise is polls and Wall Street and his base, like Tucker Carlson, who's even attacked him for his intemperate language about attacking their religion. You know, he sort of said that's disrespectful to all gods. It's disrespectful to Christians. It's disrespectful to Muslims. And he also pointed out that he was doing it on Easter Sunday, using profanity. So it's come at a fair cost, but you know, I think he just looks like a guy under enormous pressure at the moment, Trump.
And what we did see, apart from Tucker Carlson and the rest of them, is that now a Republican senator has broken ranks, and this hasn't happened before. There's definitely something shifting, and it's shifted in the last week or so, and maybe it's the polls. And when you look at what's going on in the United States now, and the polls are predicting that after the midterms, the Democrats will hold both the Senate and the House of Representatives. There are senators now sitting in the Senate, Republican senators, who are worried for the first time about actually losing their spot.
Yeah,
That's what will impact with them.
He was elected on fixing cost of living, fixing inflation, and of course, you know, he's done none of that. But he's doing this other job, and voters in that sort of situation, voters go, "Well, that's not what we employed you to do."
And,
you know, we didn't
the other
employ you.
The other one he was elected on, he promised no foreign wars.
Yeah, exactly. Which is
now they've
critically
got a nasty
important
one
to his election platform. Yeah,
We've got a nasty one, and it may go down the record books as the dumbest of them all, as I said right at the outset.
comfortably. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting to see, though, how world leaders over the years, you said that no Australian Prime Minister has ever said something of that kind to an American president, but they've never been provoked to this extent in the past. But I just recall Ronald Reagan, statesman, leader. Reagan, 1987, of the Berlin Wall, and he said, "Mr. Gorbachev," and he actually did call him Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Trump to Iran in 2026, open the fucking strait, you crazy bastards.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
What a contrast. I mean, and then, of course, along with that, he threatened to destroy their power plants and their bridges, which, by any definition, and, you know, bomb them back to the Stone Age. It does sound like a war crime to me, bombing a country back to the Stone Ages.
And Barry, it reminds me, I think it was our very first podcast 13 months ago, where you posed this question about what impact will Trump have on the federal election, and the spectre of Trump, but also that just total wall of noise of Donald Trump. And we've been doing quite a lot of polling recently, asking Australian voters, what is the biggest news story to you in the last week? And it's the top of mind question where they can nominate their answer instead of giving them a laundry list of options to choose from of what I think is, the biggest stories of the week. So, some of those stories, some of those weeks in the past, there was that tragedy of 3 shark attacks in Australia within about 36 hours. I think that was obviously a very big one for respondents. But Trump is always in the top 3. And I think that's never been done before, where a president has been so pervasive over the Australian media cycle and political cycle. I'm wondering, from your perspective, you were there in the middle of it in the Hawke government era where Reagan was president, and you probably covered a bit of George Herbert Bush as well, did you?
Yes, I went to the White House when Bob Hawke when George Herbert Bush was president. There wasn't a time back then, and even taking into recent history, where it was a negative to have a good relationship with an American president. It was always a positive. All of the leaders have loved going to the White House, and the more bells and whistles they got, the happier they were, because of that kind of the need for security and the fact that this powerful friend felt positively towards you as an individual. It was so important to them all. But that's gone now. Like you look at if it's showing up constantly in your polling and in your focus groups. Recall again the last federal election when the coalition led with 3 months to go before the election, and it all fell apart dramatically. And the overwhelming issue had to be Trump, because Trump's in the minds of so many. And here was Peter Dutton flirting with aspects of the relationship with Trump and some of the policies around Trump. And that had to have an impact. And if that's the case, Pauline Hanson has come out in support of Donald Trump without hesitation. In the end, surely that will start to erode some of her support.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's just started coming up in the focus groups. Most One Nation curious voters do like Trump. They're less opposed to Trump. In the last poll we did for the Fin Review, Trump was net minus 55, which is amongst the worst I've ever seen. For history buffs, I think the worst I've ever seen on any poll that we've done is Warwick Capper when he was flirting with running for Gold Coast Mayor. I think he was about minus 70. Great footballer, but I'm shocked. You can't take him seriously as a public figure. Trump across Australia is net minus 70. So, is minus 70. So 70% unfavourable, just 15% favourable for net minus 55. But amongst One Nation voters, there's 36% favourable and 40% unfavourable for net minus 4. But at the moment in focus groups, we're seeing that those One Nation voters, when you talk about Pauline Hanson being a great supporter of Donald Trump and the things that she said, it does cause them to hesitate a bit because they blame Trump entirely for this. And one of the other poll numbers we had out recently that Phil Curry did was when you ask them who is to blame for the higher petrol prices, just 10% blamed Albanese and 65% blamed Trump. Others voted, said it was both their fault or no one's fault. But it also brings into question the coalition's whole strategy back then a couple of weeks ago was to blame Albanese for the crisis and for the rising petrol. It's like, mate, no, only 10% believe it. And in fact, even amongst Liberal voters, only 15% believed it. So they were sort of fishing in the wrong place and trying to create a bias that didn't exist in the electorate. But it just comes back to this, wall of noise that Trump is. I mean, he's just pervasive, and he's scaring the hell out of voters now, more so now than ever before. Yeah. We're seeing it in our focus groups every night this week and last week. And again, when we're talking about, Trump and his influence over the media cycle, I was watching the ABC News the other night. The first 3 stories all included Trump. So there was the Iran conflict, obviously. He took a swipe at Australia and South Korea and Japan, so they had Albanese responding to that. That was the second story. And the third story was the Artemis 2 and Trump giving a grab about the great achievement. That is incredible. It's sort of when you think back at your day with managing the Prime Minister's media. I mean, I don't think you would have experienced that. Obviously, things like Reagan saying "tear down this wall" was a huge story for obvious reasons. But how often was like Reagan the top 3 news stories?
Yeah, no, we've never had anything like it. It's totally unprecedented. There's nothing that you can compare it with. But when you talk about how futile, in a way, some of the opposition's attacks have been, I mean, you can't blame them for trying. But it just doesn't seem to be biting. I mean, they say we need more transparency. Well, what is it? What's missing there that we're not being told about? And the address to the nation, the Prime Minister's address to the nation, I think was underwhelming and left a lot of people thinking, what was that really about? Because, with an address to the nation, that don't happen very often. And so there's an expectation that there's going to be something really pretty interesting in there. And there wasn't. It was like the opening 2 minutes to a news conference, nothing more than that. But then I thought he recovered at the National Press Club because that was really quite a comprehensive and a clear presentation with a bit of a roadmap as well. What did you make of those events?
Yeah, Mark Riley had an interesting piece afterwards saying you can see the strategy of what the Prime Minister's office wanted to do, which was position on the national address on that evening, and then the next day follow up with some detail. But it was a gross miscalculation because, of course, everybody rushed to the TVs that night. And we saw it in focus groups. Like, people were anxious, and there's a bit of post-traumatic stress out of COVID where, when a Prime Minister calls for a national address, people just worry about, well, what's going on? What is he going to announce? And so that actually created a lot of anxiety amongst the political class and the media class. Word got out pretty quickly that there was not any specific detail to be announced that night. But, of course, the great majority of voters aren't insiders, and so they were quite anxious about it. And so I thought it was a terrible miscalculation by Albanese, but he's fortunate because his opposition is so utterly terrible right now.
Well, I liked Angus Taylor's response to it. He thought, oh, well, if he can do that with not much, I can do that too. And so demanded extra time and demanded equal time and got it. But now
he's been doing all these ridiculous, he was doing all these ridiculous pick facts at service stations with Canavan and I think Jane Hume, the 3 of them at a petrol service station. I mean, none of them could change the car tyre on a Toyota Land
but
Cruiser.
Again,
so,
wasn't that just a reminder of the last election campaign when Peter Dutton every day without fail was pumping petrol, and people were saying, well, why is he doing this? But the trip to Singapore too, I think was clever politically, and I think we'd all hope that it gets some results in terms of a more reliable fuel into the future. But it made sense because Singapore, and I didn't know this until the figures started flowing, but they provide us with more than 50% of our petrol because they're a country that has major refineries, I think one of the 3 biggest in the world, 22% of our aviation fuel, 15% of our diesel. So if you can prop that up, Malaysia, who also is big in this area, has just started to make noises about the fact that maybe we should be looking after our own first. And, of course, this government doesn't want Singapore to go down that track, and so they want to guarantee it. And we've got our LNG as a kind of a trade-off as well.
Yes, that's a big one.
So, whatever the result there, it's that was worthwhile.
Yeah, again, it looks like he's taking action. And again, I think Albanese remembers all too well COVID and how the government became vulnerable, the Morrison government became vulnerable in things like, supply of vaccines and medical equipment and so forth. And he'd be very conscious that, regardless of what really is the cause of some of these problems, as the incumbent government, you're expected to fix it. So he's looking like he's got solutions. He's giving daily updates, and Chris Bowen. So they're looking like they're on top of it, which does give voters some comfort. They're anxious. In all of our focus groups, they're definitely anxious, but that's mostly anxiety about Trump. There's no sort of sense that Albanese is not on top of it. But obviously, if we start rationing and we start having massive supply issues, then that is going to cause the Albanese government a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it's you certainly learn from the mistakes of others, and when Chris Bowen said it is a race, were out there racing for the fuel. When
Yep.
recalling when Scott Morrison said of the vaccines that it's not a race, well, it was, and this is, and they want to give the impression that they're out there doing all they can. Time for a break, but when we come back, some more domestic issues, but including Matt Canavan's declaration of an economic revolution. Okay, just going back to One Nation, there was a poll out during the week. It was a compilation of about 3 months, but it shows that One Nation at a federal level is now leading all comers in Queensland, including the Labor Party, and they're strong everywhere else, 20% or better above the Liberals, I think, everywhere else. We've got this, Alicia Drew wrote to us, and she says she's a huge fan of the show and she loves how you, Tony, reflect the stories using polling and focus groups. And she writes about how you've said in the past that One Nation wants to blow up the whole system, or at least the One Nation supporters. That's part of their motivation. She says, where are the Greens in all of this? Why aren't they being more vocal and active around being the viable third option? Surely the fractures and the frustrations in the electorate are ripe for the picking. And it's a good question. I just wonder, is that because they've kind of accepted as one of the established parties and they might be feeling the same kind of pressures that the others are feeling?
One of the more glaring numbers I've seen in polling recently is that we ask, the favourability of various leaders and international leaders like Trump. When we ask about Larissa Waters, who's the leader of the Greens right now, amongst almost 50% of Greens voters say they've never heard the name. So they're just voting for the Greens for the brand. And I think, she doesn't have much cut through at the moment. The Greens are just one popular leader away, some charismatic leader who I think, will pivot off that populist economic approach. So we're seeing the rise of populist economics on the right, One Nation, and Trump is a version of that, and Farage. But then I think, there's also that emergence of left-wing populism as well. Mamdani is a classic example of that, but he's a generational talent in terms of his oratory and his delivery and his presence. I mean, he's a very charismatic fellow, even if you don't like what he stands for, and I happen to be one of them. But if the Greens had someone of a quarter of Mamdani's capacity, they would be absolutely cannibalising Labor's vote. Labor's vote would be down in the teens as well. Now, someone like Pocock in Australia is someone, he's not a Greens, obviously he's an independent, but he strikes me as that sort of independent, charismatic sort of leader who's a pretty good communicator, obviously getting better as time goes by. He's still very new. And so I think, there is absolute potential for the Greens to lift their primary vote.
And when you mention Pocock, you go back to disgruntled Liberal voters that went over to the Teals, and the Liberal Party hasn't been the same since. The one person in the federal parliament who is having that impact on disgruntled, not so disgruntled Labor voters that they'd walk away right now, but the disappointed Labor voters, Pocock. They talk about him all the time. And the potential for that guy, if he ever decided to make a bigger splash, I think is extraordinary.
In the super sample that we did for the Fin Review, which preceded the news poll won by a few days, so it was a sample of around 5,000 collected over just 1 month as opposed to a quarter. And what was really interesting there was we asked for people to recall which way they voted in the federal election last year and how they're voting now, so you can sort of read who's switched. The Coalition have lost 33% of those people that were voting for them last time, which was the low 30s from memory. They've lost 33% of them to One Nation. Labor have lost 12% of their voters from the last election to One Nation. So this confirms what we already instinctively knew, which was One Nation have cannibalised the Liberal vote, the Coalition vote, but they're also starting to eat into a bit of Labor territory. And in the South Australian election, the seat of Light, which was a very safe Labor seat, they only won by 600 votes over the One Nation candidate. So there's a precedence there. And the great danger, of course, is they've effectively created a permission structure for more voters to look at them. The other big movement that we saw in that super sample, and Barry, listeners might recall that late last year when we had a super sample, Gen X men, 25%, 1 in 4 Gen X men were voting for One Nation. That was their kind of base. Now 35% of Gen X men are voting One Nation. But there's also been, and boomers, there's also been a growth there as well. But concerningly, we're also seeing a growth in millennials to One Nation. So it's gone up 11 points from late last year to 26%. So 1 in 4 millennials are looking at One Nation. And of course in Queensland, not only is One Nation the most popular party in Queensland federally, but they're also winning on a 2PP basis.
Yeah.
So there's some frightening numbers emerge.
Earlier they used the term One Nation curious.
Yep.
And that's important. It's an important point because obviously by that you mean they're curious but not necessarily committed.
Yeah, although I've got to say, in all of our focus group research, they seem very devoted. They don't seem like they're there for turning. The exception, as I mentioned before, is when you stimulate them with information about Pauline Hanson's support for Donald Trump, which makes them hesitate. But they are very devoted at the moment. Now, there's limitations with focus groups because it's like asking a married couple on their honeymoon, is this love forever? Well, of course it is. But, things might work out differently over time. So at the moment, they're very much supporters of One Nation, and it is that burn the house down mentality. Like, another polling number we've had just recently is when we ask about the competency of politicians, it's net negative across the country, most voters. It's about net minus 30. But when you isolate just the One Nation voters, it's net minus 77. And that is, there's many different components to the One Nation support right now, and populism is one of them, and a device to sort of protest against the two-party system. But at its core is they just think they're hopeless. Both sides are hopeless.
Yeah, and I do take a point that Labor's looking over its shoulder at all of this as well, but immeasurably the Coalition has the bigger problem. We got this email from Ian that the Coalition is picking up, it's on this question whether the Coalition should pick up the grievance politics of One Nation, and he makes the point that if the Coalition convinces the electorate that immigration, net zero, is the problem, doesn't that just prove Pauline Hanson was right all along?
Yeah, well, I think the problem the Coalition's got is that they can't critique their way to government, just sort of merely sort of identifying problems with Albanese. It creates a bit of a mood for change and despondency with Albanese's approach. And he's net minus 17, so, he's not very popular at the moment, it's fair to say. But, One Nation voters are looking for something bold and dramatic right now and evidence that politicians are listening. So I think if the Coalition thinks they can just critique their way in, they're going to be very sadly mistaken.
Now, Matt Canavan's address to the National Press Club, he announced he's embarking on an economic revolution. It's tempting to say, I'll say it, they've only got 14 seats in the federal parliament. It's not a great base on which to launch a revolution. But having said that, the guy's got ideas. Let's hear them. Sounds exciting. What do you make of the revolution?
Well, of course, his pre-political career was at the Productivity Commission. So, he's no idiot. He's got an economics degree. He's obviously going to have he talked about how the Hawke and Howard era of economic reform is dead, which is interesting. Next week, we've got a speech from Angus Taylor to the Menzies Research Centre, so I'm going to be looking at that very carefully to see if he's in lockstep with Canavan or if he's going back to that Howard Hawke era type reform messages around that. And meanwhile, you've got Andrew Hastie sort of, bouncing ideas around as well, where, again, that unorthodox approach of Hastie where he's been more than happy to take a slap at Donald Trump. He's been very aggressive on One Nation. And also he's been talking about that self-sufficiency message for quite some time now, and he's copped a fair bit of criticism, especially from the Australian, which is interesting that he's prepared to take on, the so-called base. So, yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch.
But what does he actually mean by revolution, though? Of course, he talks about getting rid of net zero, digging up more coal, slashing migration. It's all sort of looking inward, sort of anti-globalisation, ignoring the inevitability and the sort of the reality of globalisation and how technologies now have no borders. just as it unfolds, I can just see him running into some difficult questions around the reality of what he's talking about. And I can't see, with net zero failed at the last election, I can't see that coming back and getting a second life.
Oh, I think there's many different components to what went wrong at the last election. As we know, it was a poorly executed campaign from Dutton's office. The nuclear energy just gave him a bullseye for Paul Erickson and Dee Madigan to hit, which they did very effectively. But in terms of that sort of the economic orthodoxies, one thing that's unmistakable in all research, not just in Australia, but we're seeing it in the UK and the United States, is globalisation first came for the blue-collar jobs, and let's be brutal, the white-collar class, the political and media class didn't see it as a problem for them. They just saw cheaper tools at Bunnings and all these sort of benefits of globalisation and rationalisation. But now, of course, it's coming for white-collar jobs. And AI is a classic example there.
Yep.
We've had about 5,000 announced redundancies just in Australia. WiseTech was one of them. And 2,000 jobs there, computer coding jobs. So what we're seeing right now is huge anxiety in the electorate about their financial security and future security. And I think Canavan does recognise that. Now, it might produce very bad economic policy, but I think it's fair to say that the public have not bought into globalisation and sort of economic rationalisation either.
Yeah, no, I get all of the points you've made about that and the anxieties in the community about jobs and AI and the rest of it. But on net zero, digging up more coal, I just think it's a demonstration yet again that the coalition still doesn't get the power of the climate change issue out there in the electorate, and I think it's been demonstrated now for 15 years.
Oh, that's lessening though at the moment, and I think this energy security debate we're having right now, I think it could go either way. Like there are some people out there saying, well, this is an argument to move more to renewable energy. But then, of course, other people pointing out the reality, by the way, which is the economy runs on diesel. There's no electric semi-trailers or electric, school buses and so forth. There's about 800,000 of those.
A lot of electric trains.
Yeah, but I mean, that ain't much help to you if you're in regional Australia or in the outer suburbs where public transport access is pretty limited.
They just announced a whole bunch of new electric trains in New South Wales running down the south coast.
Yeah.
They're in the Central Coast. They go out to the Blue Mountains.
Yep, but there's 21.5 million registered vehicles in Australia, whether it be scooters, bikes, buses, cars, passenger cars and so forth, and only about 500,000 are electric. So... Yeah. I can see the debate going either way. It's highly contestable right now, but it would be a mistake. I've seen some publications produced recently where people are just declaring it, the renewable energy debate has been won. I would not say that at the moment.
Yeah. I just want to finish up with just a couple of comments on Ben Roberts-Smith. Just to say this, look, it's no longer a civil case now, it's a criminal case. And the allegations of 5 counts of murder, you've got to make the distinction as civil cases determined because of on a balance of probabilities. The criminal test is beyond reasonable doubt. And now that we've moved into this second sphere, and it is a criminal case, usually this is a society in Australia that respects the rule of law. You can have a debate around civil cases, really, to an extent. It's part of it's tolerated. But criminal cases, not so much. There's such a law of sub judice, for example. And it just surprises me that that so many sitting politicians, Pauline Hanson for one, but others, and ex-politicians are all weighing in. They're not declaring innocence. They're not saying that. But there's mitigation in everything that they say. They're kind of reducing the severity, explaining away possible scenarios, and so on. I just don't know for how long this can go on before the authorities say, well, now, hang on. We now have a case. This is not acceptable. We just have to shut it down.
Yeah.
We saw it with the George Pell situation. We saw it on both sides. Those who were wanting a conviction and those who were just supporting him. And now we could be seeing it all over again with this one.
And again, that man, Andrew Hastie, who was a witness in the civil trial.
He was.
Which I thought took a bit of guts. And I know a lot of journos thought it was quite gutsy of him to stand up and testify. And he's likely to be called as a witness for this trial.
Well, when people do express their support for Ben Roberts-Smith, of course, you can't ignore the 21 soldiers who did stand up against him in a civil case. But Andrew Hastie has mentioned that he might be potentially a witness in the criminal case. I can't see that. I think I can see the contribution that he can make in a civil case, but I'm not so sure, unless you were there at the time, that your evidence is all that valuable. Well, that's it for today. You can write to us at Back Barries at theguardian.com. This podcast was made on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. It was produced by Daniel Simo, video production Burton DeWin.
The executive producer is Hannah Parks.
I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barry, and this is Back Barries, a Guardian Australia podcast.